Couple more. This is me in my darkroom. By the way, my name is Santu Mofokeng. This is the darkroom that I use at Wits University, where I work as a documentary photographer. At the department I work in, it's called Institute for Advanced Social Research. I spend most of my time here. The work I do here is mostly doing documentaries of communities and making a bit of research. When I say a bit of research, researching photographs, all photographs, the project that I'm involved with now, and trying to piece together information that explains the people in the photographs that I find.
So Santu, this is your office space?
Yeah, this is where I live. Save for the darkroom. This is where I live. This is where you find me. I was working as a photographer for New Nation newspaper in '88 when I was approached to come and work on the project here. At the time, it was called African Studies Institute. What the people were doing here, they were trying to develop an oral documentation, documenting people, especially the projects they were doing then was going out to all people in rural areas and finding out their stories. Okay, and this is the movement at the time to, what's the word they use now? To try and find hidden history, which is not what you find in the books and the history that was being taught in schools at the time. They're modifying curricula and trying to represent all those voices which were not represented in official history. And they had been doing this since '79. I only started here in 1988 when they realized that although they had oral documentation, they needed to supplement that with visual documentation. That's how I came to start here at Wits. Could basically go into rural areas and photographing those communities where those respondents had been interviewed, and all I could do was to actually document life as it is. Later on, in addition to covering the ground that the academics had already covered, I began to start designing my own projects. some of the projects I've done so far, if I can remember them, they're just too numerous to start. One of them is belly dancers, following the belly dancers who were at the time living at the hostels and finding ways of coming to terms with even life. They are migrants coming from the north mostly, northern Transvaal, Mamone, and those places, and then they spend their weekends playing the drums. It started purely me photographing them playing around the hostels, and then developed to going to where they come from and following them when they get invites or when they're doing the competitions. Unfortunately, that stopped because of the violence around the hostels. They couldn't continue playing, and then I then went to photograph. There's a place near. It's an old place. It actually gave birth to Katlehong, Palm Ridge, Eden Park. It's called Dugatole. It's in Germiston. And then I photographed the small community that's still left there, which is mostly colored, but there are few people staying there. And then before I came here, I had been photographing Soweto. And what I did was to continue intermittently to photograph Soweto until I felt I couldn't take that project any further. And while I was photographing Soweto, I came to realize that after having had an exhibition at the Market Theatre, I realized that the realities of Soweto, which is where I grew up, where I was born basically, that I represent in my photographs, do not necessarily translate, by which I mean that people who live in the township would not necessarily agree with the realities in my photograph or what my photographs actually represent. This actually sensitized me to the fact that after discussing with friends and about the problem that I make photographs, and then people who come to exhibitions who view my work do not necessarily come from Soweto. Not necessarily. In the main, they come from the north. And then I pondered on this problem, trying to get, I make photographs, but they're not consumed in the township where they're made. And I started struggling with ways, how can I make my work relevant to where it comes from, to the people who actually make it. And so the question was, what kind of pictures do people in Soweto actually want? What kinds of pictures do they, I've been seeing these pictures, the ones that hang in the walls, and the ones that you find in photo albums. And then I thought, maybe there's a project there somewhere. When I started taking photographs, I was informed by the kinds of images that are published in newspapers, basically. And when I joined Afropix, I wanted to document good life in the township, which is my life. And the project that I started with was a kind of metaphorical biography about my own life, where I come from, you know what I'm saying, basically. And then I was naive at the time. When I say naive, I mean in the sense that it wasn't informed by anything except the desire to try and explain who I am, especially in South Africa. Maybe explain to an audience which is not necessarily from the same situation as I am, in order to achieve some kind of understanding. When I say understanding, I mean people, just so that I didn't have to explain who I am, what I'm doing and things that I do, just to show it. But then my training is in the darkroom, working in the darkroom, newspaper darkroom, and the photographs that work, the photographs that get published or they get attention are, to quote one friend, this is not really very comfortable, he's not even a friend, but I was working in the darkroom, listening to people talking. One incident is, people were looking at these images from the Silverton siege. I don't know if you remember that, from Pretoria. Some of those pictures were very hard to look at, the bombing and right. And then one guy actually called another guy and says, come and look at this. They were looking at this slide, right? And then one of them said, it's a beautiful slide. And what was beautiful in that photograph was blood and someone lying on the ground. And the one guy says, well, why do you think this photograph is beautiful? Why do you say that? Because someone's lying, obviously dead or something. And the man said, don't you know this is beautiful, Chana? And then our guy said, no, but this is ghoulish. You can't say this is beautiful. And the man said, don't you know that black skin and blood make beautiful contrast? And I don't know what my reaction was at the time, but okay. I went on to become a photographer and to understand. The other thing is, do you remember when CNN came here in '94? They came here and they were hoping that the elections were going to be bloody. But it was a bad investment for them. They had to leave finally, because if it doesn't bleed, if there's no war, it's not a picture. And those kinds of things, they inform what is a good photograph and what is not a good photograph. And also, what I do in my documentaries, in trying to document my life and where I come from, it's also informed by what's happening around me, what people consider wonderful, beautiful. I know what a salon picture is. My training is long, very long. It begins in the darkroom, ends up in a photography, international photography center, and you understand. But what's lacking in my work is that it doesn't talk, as I say, it doesn't talk to the people. When I started taking photography as a profession, it's that I had been making photographs as a street photographer before, and then now, being my professional work, I wanted to reflect the shift that I'm a professional, I'm a pro now. I don't make snapshots. I don't make photographs for the album, and basically what I'm saying is that I realized that my audience was not necessarily in the communities where the images were made. And then I began to ask the question, what kinds of images do people really want? And this led me to start looking in people's photo albums. Yeah. And then I'll show you some of the pictures that I found. I found some of these contemporary images. Some of them are hanging on my wall, which I have in my family, but I also saw other images there which did not quite talk to me, which I couldn't understand. All photographs that people keep or have kept, and which were made a long time ago. And I realized that these images, because they were not talking to me, that there was something wrong with how I was taught, my education. And when I began to delve into those images to find out the history, what position do they occupy in documentaries, so to speak, because they are actually documents, small documents of people's lives, how they see themselves, and then how they actually wanted their families to look at them in the future. Where's the box? As I say, looking at family albums, you actually come across some of these images which actually began to puzzle me, because I didn't know what to make of them. What role they actually played in our society, and I could see that these photographs were very old, but why they puzzled me, the more I thought about it, was because of my education. Education in the sense that when they say these pictures were made around the 10th of the century, I've been taught that people were wearing loincloths in that time. And look at these pictures. Okay.
Where did you get the idea of people wearing loincloths? I mean, you had seen photographs like that, or what?
This is my education. This is what I was taught, so to speak.
And not only you, I mean, everybody.
Everyone,
isn't that
yes.
so?
What's happening here is, and then I started going back to try and find out what these images actually meant. Not from the family, what they occupy in the family, but more or less what do these pictures mean. And then I started going to museums to libraries, looking for these images, trying to learn more. And then I realized that as the Africana Museum, when I went there, I realized that they didn't have any pictures of families. At least in the urban space, they didn't have any pictures like these. And then if you were looking for photographs of black families, you'd have to look under functional, or specific, very functional categories like dress. When you look at the history of dress, or when you're looking at fashion, or you're looking at Christian weddings, I mean, those are some of the categories where at least you could see people in a family setting. And I started inquiring more, and then I went to the Star Archives, and then I spoke to the man who was in charge, and then I saw some photographs of nude women in Zululand in those places, and I said, are these the only pictures that were being made around the time? And then he said no. And then I asked, didn't people go to studios to make photographs? He said no, they couldn't afford it. And that was the answer. But I wasn't happy. Okay. And I realized, there's a lack in South Africa, an omission, you might call it, maybe even an illusion, if you care to use that term. That does not necessarily cover people's experiences, at least in the 19th century, late 19th century, and around the turn of the century. And then I realized that there was there was a need, to actually create an archive about the history of black families in the urban space. And then the more I inquired about these images, I became aware of the voice outside the frame, which actually explains why these pictures were not there, why they were not made. Yeah, we need to remember that when South Africa was still trying to create, politicians were trying to create a state called South Africa, we didn't speak of natives as being part of the state. It was a part of the state, but it wasn't, basically. Natives were okay out there in the reserves, but in the towns they were all workers. It didn't matter what your designation was. You could have been a chief, you could have been a doctor, or you could have been... It didn't matter where you came from, in terms of status, as in education, or possessions, or whether you own property. It didn't really matter. We only spoke, in the urban space, in the towns, we had workers. And then in the reserves, we had natives living in those reserves. So what this actually translated into, you could have photographs of workers, people working on the mines or on the rails. It didn't matter. Portray people as workers, and that's it. But because the natives, when they came into town, it was only as temporary sojourners, coming to work and then going back to their homes and not having the rights to settle permanently here. So, in the interest of the politicians, the photographs that you find, that were collected, that you find in museums or that you find in libraries, they are photographs of workers, basically. But because it was acceptable to speak of the native in his own environment, so we have a lot of photographs, which you might call ethnographic studies, that show people wearing traditional clothes, loincloths, going about, miming their everyday lives. There's an abundance of that kind of iconography regarding South African archives, or people actually belonging to nature, probably, how can I say, depicted in the same visual language as you would photograph flora and fauna. There's no shortage of that kind of imagery, but we are aware that the missionaries had been involved in their project to try and civilize the natives, and that there were a lot of people who owned property and then who lived their lives in a way and consider themselves civilized. And probably some of the photographs that I have, that I'm finding here, come from that class of people. So. As I indicated earlier, that the photographs that you find under those categories I mentioned before, you're seeing images with no context in them. No context, just dress or fashion or whatever. And I thought there was a need to actually create an archive whereby you can get the image as an index to prompt your questions, and as an index for research, because you have an image, and then to get the context, which is family stories about who those people are, where they came from, what their lives were like, and if possible, what happened to them. And where I began finding one or two photographs in the township, sometimes getting referrals from friends, acquaintances. This is how I began the research. It was kind of hard. And then a friend of mine made me aware that he knew a friend who had a box full of photographs. They're all photographs. And then they knew more or less what I was looking for. There's some 68 images in here. And when I began to ask the questions about who owned the box, where is this box coming from? And then you get answers like, this belonged to my grandmother, and when she died, she left it here. It's been lying here underneath. Okay. And then I looked at the images, and the man told me that his grandfather was in one of the pictures here. But research being research, he couldn't identify his grandfather. And then what happened is, I had to go to their relative in Velkom, which is around 400 kilometers from here, to try and get more information. And after a while of sitting and looking at the images, they finally decided on this image that this was their grandfather. This was their grandfather, because he seems to appear in more photographs here in this box, more than anybody else in the picture. And this is what the photograph looked like. And then I copied the image. This to make a negative for my archive. I was intending to take the box back to them. And then I went from that place, and then I went to Bloemfontein. And then in a church, because I realized that whoever was in here, they might have been associated with church. Bloemfontein, there's an old church in Bloemfontein there, the AMEC church. And when I made an appointment, got into the church, I saw some photographs lying on the wall, hanging on the wall. And I saw the man who my respondent had told me that he was his grandfather. But on the wall, he was represented as somebody else. He's Pakani, to my respondent, the person who gave me the box. But on the wall, he's somebody else. He's Gaba, who was a bishop around the turn of the century. And I understood from research which had been made by Jim Campbell that Gaba was actually instrumental or very useful. Or the AME Church and him were instrumental in forming the South African National Congress. So I got more details about this man. But up to now, I'm still looking for the grandfather. Who's the grandfather in this box? I've got names. Some of these photographs are interesting in that they have written at the back, my brother Elliot Pakani, in Bethlehem, location OFS, stand number 1161. That's all. And then you try and follow this information through, and there's no Pakani in all of Bethlehem. So, yeah, as I said earlier, I get an original image like this, and then I copy it. I make a negative and make a print. And then what happens to the print is that once I get information, I got information here on this man, and then it's on the computer in there. Basically what I'm saying is that I get a photograph, and then I make a copy, and then after I make a copy, I make a copy negative, and after I make a copy negative, I make some prints, and then I speak to the family to give you information. If it's a relative, it's a father, whatever, and give me some background about the photograph. And this, I put it on computer, the information, and the photograph, I put it in sleeves like here with the information that go with it. Slowly, I put it into sleeves like this, where you have the photograph, and then you have details about who the person is. Okay, let's see. Yeah, basically I get these images like this. This is the original, and then I make a copy. This is the copy of this image. That means I have an egg, right? And then this image is going to be filed in a sleeve like one of these here. Where you have, here's the photograph, here's the name, and then here's some information about this person here. And it hangs in these drawers here. In my research, I'm basically looking at the original photographs. If you give me a photograph and it's already copied, I cannot refer back to, I cannot tell how old the image is. I have to see the thing itself. You know what I'm saying? You can see how it's aged and what's happened to it. And then you can see also from this what kind of processes were used by the photographers. This actually helps me to date the photographs, the age of the photograph itself. So, yeah, as I say, I'm making very little headway in this box because most of the people who are in this photograph are already dead. But there's some very wonderful images. I don't know. This is only one of the many images that I find, right, where you find people actually go into a studio to have their photographs made. But constantly what I find, when you look at the photograph itself, the background is false because it's been painted in to make it look like, oh my God, this is almost like it's a palm tree going over there. And every one of these guys is wearing a fob wash, and I don't know why is it that most of the pictures that I have, that I'm looking at, people are wearing fob washes. Is it something that the photographer uses as a prop, so that when you come in, you sit down, he dresses you up? Are these their clothes? I mean, these are some of the questions that are coming to me. I have no answer to that. But,
do you think that these people were really wealthy landowners? I mean, is it likely?
What's going on here is probably going to the studio was an occasion. This is, people made an effort. And it's very difficult to guess what they were thinking when they to talk to who is this photograph intended for? Is it for relatives back home, or is it something that you care about and say, this is me? Because once you've got yourself in a photograph, it's very safe. A photograph doesn't change, it doesn't move, it doesn't, you know what I'm saying? I'm struggling for words here, but what I don't know, that they are real, they existed, that we cannot dispute. But what station they held in life, I don't know. Very difficult. I mean, these guys, they actually look like workers. They could be working in the mines. Maybe they're friends, I don't know, or relatives. I don't know yet. This research is very hard. Hard in the sense that, how can I say, it's new. People misunderstand my intentions on the one side. That I'm trying to collect history, and then I'm trying to, how can I say, preserve it for posterity. Because what's happened, I mean, even within families, I mean, when I start posing the questions, you actually realize that those are the kinds of questions they haven't even thought about. You know what I'm saying? And that makes it difficult on one side. And also, the other thing is that maybe I come in a period where photography has been so commercialized that when you try, when I come in to collect data or maybe to ask for photographs, people will ask you if there's any money in it for them. That's another problem. And the other problem is, I'm going to pause a little bit to compose myself. I'm going to pause a little bit.
Okay, it's fine.
Yeah, your question about whether there's any chance I can get information. Yes, with some of the families I've actually been lucky.
Okay.
Yeah, with this one I got lucky because I actually find that the obituary of this lady had been preserved with a photograph. Obituary, is that obituary? The stuff they write after you die and that kind of stuff, which actually narrated where she came from, what she did in her life. But it's not very often that you get that lucky. Sometimes you find a photograph like this. Going back to the box, a photograph like this, and the only thing that I have is that the name of the person is written at the back. It's written in the back, and when I was going through the back, the box, sorry, when I was going through the box, actually, I found this photograph, which, when you look on the back, it actually says a present from, and there's a stamp in there, and then this photograph was actually intended for Jane Malloy, and in the same box I have Jane Malloy in this image here. I have not been able to trace Jane Malloy or the Malloy families. But what I've actually found out about this man is that he was a composer. I think he was a composer of hymns in the Methodist Church. And his name is P.G. Mdevuga, and some of his work has been published. It has been published. Whether this photograph of Mdevuga and this photograph of Jane Malloy are connected, I don't know. Whether this is the Jane Malloy that Mdevuga actually sent to, I don't know. I'll never know that. But in the same box too, there's another photograph here. I have it. Did I show it to you? A second. There is one. This one here, the yellow one. Yellow hood.
You don't have a copy of that one?
I don't. It's gone. The copy is gone. I don't have to read it. Okay. You don't have to. And then it says in the photograph here, at the back, it says, this is Jewel Malloy. This is Jewel Malloy. But you look at this woman here, it doesn't read too much because it's too old and it's very faint. But you look at that face and you look at that face, it looks like it's Jane Malloy when she was younger. In the one photograph, she's wearing some headdress, and then in the other photograph, you can see the forehead. That is a connection. I'm like, damn, I'm developing into becoming an investigator. This is what this research has done to me. these are small clues. I mean, the only connections that I make, I mean, they could be fiction. This could be, these people maybe are not, they're not necessarily related. This is not the Jane Malloy that PG Mdebuga is talking about. I don't know. It's not very often that you find so many photographs in one box coming from one family. Sometimes I get one from one family, maybe two, maybe sometimes I get nothing, which is what research is all about. What's happening here is this family I was made aware of by a relative of mine, that they had some 27 images, all of them very old. When you look at the process is I think the material, I don't have the originals, so I send them back. The materials are old, they're also very brown. Yeah. What's happening there is, I'm looking at a couple here, and I have the name here. Her name is, her daughter calls her Oma Maria. And this is a brother, John, the brother to Maria. And Maria, her surname was Maria van der Merwe. And then when I asked the family what van der Merwe, what is the connection, van der Merwe? And then my respondent actually told me that her grandmother was an Urlam. And this is a term which is not too familiar to many people, Urlam. And then, but in her own words, in her own references, I mean, Urlam meant that she said her mother was Lekhoba, which means, translates actually into English, she was a slave, because they were slaves. But Urlam, sometimes people refer it to and book selling. I mean, these are academics. And book selling, which actually means kids are taken by, what's the word? The proper interpretation is that, and book selling reflects to forced juvenile apprenticeship, working for white families. You're forced to work there, and then you become inducted into the family. Sometimes you adopt the name of the family. This is what had happened to them. But when this old lady, Mom TV, when she was talking about this, she told me that, this family was actually successful farmers. I don't know, tenant farmers, or whether they own their own land, I'm not too sure. Successful farmers at the turn of the century. And then her brother, she referred to him as having been the one who looked after them. For a long time, I've been involved with my research, this old photographs we're looking at just now. And I haven't been taking photographs of my own. My photography, as such, was beginning to suffer. And then, beginning this year, I decided that I needed to go back to making photographs, to take care of my own, just to see for myself whether I can still make documentary images. Because getting involved with the image itself, what it means, actually makes it very difficult for you to go out and make photographs, because my mind is where it's beginning to question documentary, news image, and saying, I'm looking at those issues. I'm looking at issues of the politics of making images. And when I decided, I hadn't actually thought about, beginning of this year, I hadn't actually thought about what I was going to do. What is it I was going to photograph and document? And then I realized, just sitting around my office, that I've been taking photographs, and what do I have? Just images laying around my office. And what's in there is, I have in my body of work, looking at my body of work, I realized that although I've been doing although I've been doing a kind of metaphorical biography about my life, there's a subject that I had neglected for a long time. And that subject is my own spirituality, how it influences the way I am, the decisions that I make. I hadn't looked at that. Maybe it is because on the one side, trying to deal with this spirituality is not, in some circles, politically on. So this is the beginning that you're looking at, that I'm sitting around, looking at images of people at prayer, of people looking at, how can I say, trying to come to terms with their own mortality, their fears, success, and one way, as I say, one way for me was to look at the things that concern a lot of South African blacks, which they don't necessarily talk about, which actually in my life has realizing that I've moved away from that life, although I live within it, but I've moved away, and which leads to a kind of schizophrenic existence, schizophrenia, because I don't talk about it. These images you're looking at, they are merely a beginning. They're just only a start. I mean, then I chose this place, Clarence, after I saw a video documentary. Well, I wasn't happy with the way the documentary was actually handled, but the answer is neither here nor there. And so I went to Clarence, and then I went to Clarence around the time of the Good Friday. And I know what I was looking for, basically. I had some clue about what I wanted to capture.
Santu, in your experience as a photographer, do people want to be portrayed as they are, or do they try and present an image for the photographer?
Yeah, it's a kind of turn on, saying you're trying to turn them on so you can get the image that you want. And they try to turn you on just so that you make them come out in a flattering kind of way. And that's why I don't do a lot of portraiture on the one side. And if I make a portrait, it's an accident. I do when people commission me, but I'm never quite happy because what I'm looking for, that's not what they're looking for. They already have a sense of how they'd like to be portrayed. And there's some stories, very funny stories about what happens every time you lift a camera and you say, I'm going to make a photograph. Some of them are funny. Someone will say, please let me go put on my deodorant or something before I make the picture. So there's so much going on between the act of lifting the camera and taking someone's spirit and the act of making the picture.
Do photographs tell the truth?
No.
Why did you say that?
There's so much, actually, there's so much that's happening outside the frame which doesn't go into the photograph. That's on one side. Aside from the fact that, how can I say, the limitation of photography being two-dimensional. And at the time I'm making the picture, there's so much going on, smells, sounds, which I don't actually get. Photographs don't tell the truth, at least for me they don't. They used to. When I was naive, starting out, that's what I thought they did. And what? Photographs can be, we know, they can be manipulated by captions, and then they can change depending on where you place them. Their meanings, although the internal stay the same, but you can read them differently if you see one photograph in an album, if you see it in a gallery space, amongst, when you change context also, sometimes the meaning is actually disturbed. So the meaning of the photography is not necessarily static. You know what I'm saying? There's no, I mean, people actually could bring in their own prejudices. Somebody, I think it's Jim Crow, who actually said that photographs, like travel, they confirm already held prejudices. I believe in that. I buy into that, yeah. Capturing for posterity, I'm not too sure. But what I do know is, in my photography, why I've started actually writing and talking to my photographers, it is that I'm going to write my biography. Nobody's going to do that for me. All these pictures, even if they're about things, but they're also about me. In one way, I'm actually trying to write my own history about things that I care for, about things that concern me, or about things that bother me. And if this is going to sound apocalyptic, if I die, at least you know my story, because I put it down.